So, waterborne diseases are diseases that are spread by contaminated water. So, water that if someone was sick, someone who had one of these waterborne diseases and their fecal matter got into the waterway, someone else drinking that water or in contact with that water could get sick from that disease. And so the result of that is, or the impact of each of these is um, diarrhea. And so diarrhea, I'll write that here, Diarrhea. Okay, you'll see British spellings of it in some places too. But diarrhea, which basically leads to dehydration. So there is not enough fluids in them. And if they're not treated, it can lead to death. And all of these here, so all of these, this is really what happens. So it's diarrhea. Sometimes it could be vomiting too, but basically diarrhea. If they they can't keep anything down, their body dehydrates and then it can lead to death. And this typically is an issue in developing countries where people have less access to clean water. And so that is the impacts of things like dysentery, typhoid, cholera, hepatitis A. They're all waterborne diseases. Now, shifting gears, I want to just some air pollutants and some of their impacts. So the first one here is tropospheric ozone. That's that ground level ozone. And a quick, as you recall, when nitrogen oxides, so NO, NO2, so I'm just going to call it NOx, so nitrogen oxides, and my hydrocarbons, or the other name for those was VOCs, react in the presence of sunlight, you're going to get this ground level ozone. And this is going to cause severe respiratory distress. Okay, that was my cough right there too for you. Severe respiratory distress, which in some cases people with asthma could trigger an asthma attack, which could lead to death. So I'm going to even put here, trigger an asthma attack. And again, an asthma attack, a person can't breathe if they're not getting enough oxygen. Their cells can't do aerobic respiration and they could die. So that is from tropospheric ozone. Tropospheric ozone, or ground level ozone, remember, is in cities typically produced when there's a lot of cars around, because the car engines produce the NOx. The gasoline is the source of the VOCs. In lots of cars, you're going to get that tropospheric ozone. Particulate is basically going to cause the same issues. PM 2.5 is really small particles that can get into your lungs, gets past your mucous membranes and your nose hairs, and everything else gets into your lungs, and again can cause respiratory distress and trigger an asthma attack. Asbestos is an indoor air pollutant, and asbestos is a little bit different. Asbestos, basically, it's these tiny little fibers, and those fibers will stab your lungs. And then when they stab your lungs, there's scar tissue that builds up in your lungs. And in that scar tissue, your lungs become very kind of brittle almost. And you could get a form of lung cancer called asbestosis, which is basically a type of lung cancer. Or the other type of lung cancer you'll often hear about, and I'll write it here, is mesothelioma. Okay, and that is also associated with asbestos. And that is actually, there's like a lining around your lungs, and that is a cancer essentially in that lining. And so those are the human health impacts associated with asbestos. You may have heard of mesothelioma. Sometimes there's commercials for attorneys trying to see if people have gotten mesothelioma, because often it can be linked pretty easily, not pretty easily, but it can be linked back to asbestos exposure. And the last one on here is radon. Radon is an indoor air pollutant. It comes from the natural decay of uranium-238. It decays, it's radioactive, so it decays, it releases radioactive particles, and eventually, after a whole series, it's going to decay. Radium is actually going to decay to this radon. And when this radon is a gas, this gas now goes up through the pores in the soil and can get into basements and areas that aren't well ventilated. We don't really hear about this in the outdoor because there's so much other air mixing with it, but in indoor areas, it can get higher concentrations. It gets through the cracks in your foundation, and then you inhale it, and it is associated with lung cancer because it is what's called an alpha emitter. An alpha, it decays and that can damage your lung tissues and lead to lung cancer. And actually, the leading cause of lung cancer among non-smokers is believed to be radon. So this is just kind of different pollutants and kind of different human health impacts. Again, waterborne is diarrheal diseases. Tropospheric ozone and PM 2.5 are severe respiratory distress, can trigger asthma attacks, which could kill someone. Asbestos is linked with mesothelioma, and radon is linked with lung cancer. It's the leading cause of lung cancer among non-smokers. So that was just a quick review of some of that. Hope that was helpful.